first speaker on our panel for this afternoon is Dr. Ralf Trapp, who will be addressing Russian allegations of biological weapon activities in Ukraine. It's a topic that I think we are all very well familiar already, simply because that has been on the news for quite a number of months now. And for people familiar, of course, with the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, those kinds of allegations are definitely, you would be familiar that these are not new phenomenon, but the intensity that we've been witnessing over the recent months has really been of a staggering scale, and it's a topic worth addressing when we are thinking about CBRN threats. And just a couple of words about our speaker. So Dr. Ralf Trapp, he's an independent consultant on chemical and biological weapons, arms control and disarmament. He's a chemist and toxicologist by training, and he was a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, CBRN, and also for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He has worked for a number of years with the Technical Secretariat of the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that is based in The Hague, and is the watchdog for the Chemical Weapons Convention. At present time, he's essentially working on different international initiatives in collaboration with UN agencies, once again, the OPCW, the European Commission, and international civil society think tanks, organizations, you name it. Without any further ado, Dr. Trapp, please, you have the floor, and we very much look forward to your presentation. And thanks a lot for agreeing to be with us today.
Thanks, Tatiana, and thank you very much, you and the organizers, for inviting me for this meeting. As you just mentioned, I'm going to talk about allegations that we've seen go through the media, but not only in the media, but also in diplomatic circles, Russian allegations about biological weapons activities in the Ukraine, and in this context, also, by the way, in other countries, but the focus at the moment very much is on the Ukraine, given the current situation with the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, then talk about specifically the allegations concerning the Ukraine and the United States and their activities, or rather funding in that country. I will look a little bit at some of the detail in the context of the process that took place initiated by Russia under Article 5 of the Biological Weapons Convention. That is a consultative process in case of concerns about non-compliance. And then I'll say a few words about how this, from my perspective, works, and possibly what the consequences might be. As a health warning at the beginning, I should stress that this is, of course, this presentation has a very strong focus, given the circumstances, on Russian claims regarding alleged VW activities. But everybody who's been working in this field knows that this whole history of biological warfare is full of misperceptions, misrepresentations, false allegations, propaganda. So this is nothing terribly new. The context is new, and the intensity, as Tatiana said just a moment ago, is new. And insofar, I'm talking about that particular case, but there are, and there have been other cases where biological weapons issues have been misrepresented or used in a political context. Now, looking at Russia, and one has to really put it into the longer context of the Soviet Union and Russia, this attempt to put disinformation into the public domain about biological weapons activities of other countries is nothing new. It really goes back the very beginning of or even before the Cold War actually began, with campaigns that some people have identified three major campaigns in this context: the Korean War, with claims of American use of biological weapons in this context, a whole range of different types of weapons and of vectors. a Pakistani claims against a Pakistani research laboratory in the 80s, which as a result of those claims actually had to be shut down. The claim being that this was funded by the US, that actually was true, but there was developing killer mosquitoes for release in Afghanistan. And then the other one, and that one I actually followed a little bit closer in the past myself, the claims about HIV, the virus responsible for AIDS. And there have been claims, some of them emerging actually in my ex-country, the German Democratic Republic, about the fact, or not the fact, but the assertion that this virus had been developed and released from US military laboratories that dealt with biological weapons research, and that the intention would have been to damage and to destroy African populations. There are a couple of things on the slide, as you can see here, that relate to why we know for a fact that this information was false. Admissions by people who've actually worked in the services that put this information out. Some archival material that was available at the end of the 1980s, and other things that are not just a suspicion that there was something wrong, but in fact it has been admitted by people directly involved in this. It went relatively quiet on the Soviet/Russian side into the 1990s, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Russian state. But towards the end of the 1990s, things began to change again, and we see senior military officials that were previously involved in the Russian biological weapons program, a program that, by the way, went on despite the fact that Russia was a signatory, is a state party of the Biological Weapons Convention, and also one of the depositories of the treaty, so has a particular responsibility vis-a-vis that treaty. Things, to some extent, were sort of a rehash of old misinformation stories that had already been put out. So a back reference to HIV again, and of course a back reference to the Korean War. But there were also new claims, and one of the most outrageous, as far as I can say, was first SARS and then in January 2020. We remember the claims that came out of certain people on the Western side, concerns, but also more strongly phrased claims that SARS-CoV-2 would have been emerged from a Chinese biological institute in Wuhan. But there were also claims coming out of Russia that it was actually a virus that had been elaborated in NATO biological laboratories. So this is nothing new. It has had calmed down a little bit and then went on again since more or less the end of the 1990s. Some of the characteristics of these campaigns, and that has changed a little bit over time. In the past, typically these things were planted initially into media outside of the Soviet Union, in other countries, in India, in Pakistan, and elsewhere, and were then picked up by Soviet media and were then basically spread, and depending on how the story evolved, then eventually taken up also by official sources or not. In recent years, we see a shift towards things coming directly out of official sources in Moscow, the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, and also in some cases directly from the FSB. And we also see a much more strong and a much more efficient, I should say, use of social media and the internet as a multiplier to disseminate the information and to bring it out into the open. It is increasingly aligned with the activities of other countries. I've mentioned here Iran, China, and North Korea. These are the most obvious ones, but some other countries were also aligning there, or were sort of getting involved in these campaigns. And some of the focus, at least if not a strong focus, has been on the US program to support the transformation of former Soviet biological weapons facilities under the non-Lugar CTR program. The example that I'm mentioning here is the Lugar Center in Tbilisi. And if you want to read up on this, here is the reference to an article by Philippa Lentzos in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which sets out in quite some detail what these allegations were. And in fact, Philippa was on a group that conducted a visit in response to some of these allegations in Tbilisi and reported about that. She was the rapporteur of that group. So it is pretty clear that we're dealing with a very deliberate and targeted misinformation campaign. There also have been informations that were made available about this context, about this center, in the context of the Biological Weapons Convention intersessional process. Here's a reference to a document that you can have a look at. I mentioned already that this campaign in the past, or these campaigns in the past, went alongside an increasing and expanding Soviet offensive biological weapons program. So they were to some extent a front there to cover this program and also to direct attention to others, but also probably to some extent to find excuses or to generate opinions that would, I wouldn't say tolerate a Soviet violation of the Biological Weapons Convention, but that could be used, as I say, to protect that program. The other thing I wanted to simply throw back into this discussion is, before Putin became president again in 2012, he set out a number of tasks for the Russian Ministry of Defense. These were strategic orientations for the ministry. And there was a task in there which was quite interesting, and it looked at science-based new developments and principles. And amongst them, you find things, a reference to genetic and psychophysical things. That gets not just very close, that really gets into the realm of biological and chemical weapons of the future. Now, this was removed later on from government websites and explained as something that was actually not relating to what the Soviet, what Russia was planning to do, but what related to threats emanating from foreign countries. This is a technique that has been used in the past to explain things that in fact meant something different. Anyway, okay, let's now talk a little bit about the Ukraine. Here are a few examples. As I said, this began earlier, but just a few examples of things as we move towards the invasion into the Ukraine. Already in April 21, in Russian media are references to US biolaboratories in the Ukraine and elsewhere, specific mentioning of particular, not facilities, but places, Odessa, Lviv, Kharkiv, and also hints that there are risks involved, very dangerous work. And this little reference at the end, because the world is already experiencing the pandemic. This is the beginning of COVID-19, of course. So we're seeing an association here of, it's not said explicitly that this work was associated with the outbreak of the pandemic, but there was a link to this. And we saw that later on coming out actually as a direct indication from Russia that NATO biolabs were working on this. We then have, just before the begin of the invasion, state media in Russia and other media outlets, and also bloggers on the internet and elsewhere, providing a whole campaign of claims, a whole range of claims about the establishment of a network of bioweapons laboratories in the Ukraine by the United States. The US responded to some of these things in discussions both in Washington and elsewhere. And then in March, that's after the invasion had started, a statement that I found interesting, that in the course of this so-called special military operation, there were facts emerging that suggested an extensive cleaning operation to get rid of traces of a biological weapons program in the Ukraine. And then there were references to particular agent. So you can see that this was building up, and that was creating a certain picture of what supposedly was going on. If you go into this database here, which is an EU thing, or at least funded by the EU, I think it is, you get an idea of how intensive this thing was. I did just a very top level search for the time period from January 22 till a couple of days ago, and there are 286 results for the keyword biological, and they're not all necessarily about Ukraine, but the majority, absolute majority of those is, you can also go in there and see what the actual story was, and also the debunking of that story, because they were, of course, all misinformation things. But then it moved on. It moved from allegations in the media, allegations on the internet, and also Russian formal statements into something that ended up under Article 5 of the BWC. In December 21 already, the Russian Defense Ministry talked about American military contractors secretly smuggling materials into the Ukraine. Then came the beginning of the invasion, then statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that indicating that Russia has documents that showed clear evidence the US had supported bioweapons program in the Ukraine. And then finally, first meetings in the UN Security Council, which, by the way, are worthwhile watching. In terms of both how Russia had prepared this, there were a whole range of very sleek and interesting presentations made to underpin their claims. But also it was clear from those meetings that the majority of countries had nothing, had no information to any about any of these allegations, and the UN itself, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, made it clear on several occasions that the UN has no information about any biological weapons activities in the Ukraine. Then we get towards May and June, and increasingly we see an indication that Russia is going forward towards invoking Article 5 of the Biological Weapons Convention. About a fortnight before that happened, which was on the 29th of June, Russia actually submitted bilaterally a range of questions to the UN, to the United States. The US responded with a procedural response because some of the documents were not legible, so they said we can't actually respond to that until we can actually read it. But I mean, in a normal diplomatic process, even in a build-up crises, one would expect that this goes forward and backward several times, and that the parties to this dialogue would make attempts to resolve the issues before it goes much further. In this particular case, Russia decided to take it straight into a formal consultative meeting of the BWC under Article 5. Now, this here is a short summary of the main points that were made by Russia, and I don't want to talk you through all of this. You will have otherwise access to the slides. What I'd like to point out is here, remember what you heard in the morning session from Malcolm Dando and Michael Crawley when they talked about their methodology of looking at activities, published activities in that particular case, and how they tried to identify things that are of possible concern and that needed to be clarified further. And there were points in their methodology that had to do with policy and practices associated with weaponization activities. There were the context of a research establishment and the personnel involved in this field. And then there was the question of agents. And there was not just the question of new agents, but also indication of production activities and of work on dissemination. Bear this in mind when you look at the details here, because what we see here is attempts to say, well, yes, they have this culture collection at the Verkhnikov Anti-Plague Research Institute, and it's not consistent with Ukraine, with what Ukraine really needs, with what the public and sanitary situation in the country is. Yes, but culture collections are set up for a whole range of reasons, and they don't necessarily 100% reflect the actual current sanitary situation in a country. So this is a question of interpreting what is there and then trying to sort of move it into a slightly different, or give it a different taint, a different color. The other examples I here you see is the research documents on transmission of zoonotic viruses and by wild birds or by bats, a work which, by the way, is done in a whole range of different countries, because that is one of the things you need to study when you look at the zoonotic diseases. The discovery of drones, which, yes, may be an indication that somebody is working on something that has to do with dissemination, but disseminating of what? And what there was had more or less suggested that this was more likely related to agricultural uses. And then a question of a US patent application, which again, in itself, it's not demonstrate a violation of the convention, but it may be something that needs to be clarified, and there is no question about that. The question is whether one needs to take this into an Article 5 process. Here are some of the specific misrepresentations, and this follows a presentation by the United States at the Article 5 consultative meeting, so I'm not going to too much detail. But you see that some of the questions posed by the United States were quite detailed. There was quite a lot of specific detail by Russia. I'm sorry. There was quite a lot of detail behind it. And so sometimes you get the impression that it was about giving as much specific detailed information out as possible, and then something is going to stick. So here are some of the issues where you can say, okay, is this an indicator for malign intent, or is it actually something that is normal practice, or that is practice that makes sense in the context of the particular facility and institution that we are talking about? From storage of pathogens to transfer of strains. There were also a few things where simply text was misquoted or misinterpreted. And then there is a reference to this technical assistance plan. So there are a couple of legal issues that also came up in terms of how you interpret the fact that something is required in the local context of the Ukraine and make that part of a suspicious activity. I'm not saying that all of this is necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of factual information behind it, and I can see that people may even have concerns about some of these things. But the normal process in the BWC context is that you then, on a bilateral basis, try to clarify these things with the other side and figure out what's actually going on. And by the way, there are also mechanisms that you can use in the regular BWC processes. Is this all worth taking it to a formal consultative process, which actually builds on an underlying assumption that there was possibly a violation of the Biological Weapons Convention? Here are a few more examples, and that's one of the things I wanted to also flag up. A lot of these things have to do with transparency of activities, with the transparency of why research is done, whether it is reported about, what the context was, and so on and so forth. And Russia made a very specific association with the mechanism of the BWC in the context of confidence building measures, saying that none of this had been reported. And that is probably true, because I mean, I don't have access to the CBM forms, but not the forms, but the actual responses by countries. But I know from the structure of the forms that this is not about providing information as such about bilateral assistance in certain areas. I'm not suggesting one shouldn't talk about that. I'm not suggesting one shouldn't adapt the CBM forms to make it, give them a broader range. That's been attempted several times to make them more useful for what they are supposed to be doing, which is building confidence and compliance. But it's not that this was all secret. I mean, the information about these activities, about the facilities, etc., was on the internet. It was presented at BWC intersessional meetings. The studies were published, and a whole range of other countries were involved in these activities, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. And also, it is actually a formal requirement of this funding stream from the United States that study results and other aspects of these studies must be made publicly available and published. So you can see where this came from. So here's the outcome of this process. And it essentially was a procedural report that came out of it. There's no decision, obviously, no consensus was reached regarding the formal outcome of the meeting, whether or not there was compliance or not non-compliance. But it's clear from the whole context, and it's very clear from reading the statements at the meeting, that the absolute majority of countries didn't buy into the claims from Russia. Even the close allies of Russia stopped short of sort of taking that last step and claiming that there was, in fact, indication of treaty violations. China, who went the furthest, called for more efforts to respond to the questions, listed some additional questions, and was supportive of the Russian call for a follow-up activity, which would be under Article 6 of the Convention, which would take it into the UN Security Council. we'll see whether that's going to happen, and we also see how this is all going to affect the proceedings and the discussions at the upcoming BWC review conference. For me, the most the sort of the best summary that I've seen, and also from a country that is not in NATO and is not, it's basically a neutral country, Switzerland, is at the bottom of the screen, which put out a firm view that the allegations made have not been substantiated, that the conclusions drawn are neither convincing nor credible, and that they do not allow to draw a conclusion that obligations under the treaty had been violated. That very much summarizes also my impression of reading the documentation that was made available. So why is this happening, and also how is it happening? And here I'm moving into a domain that where I'm probably more speculating and relying on other people's research and work. But there is a strong component, obviously, in influencing domestic audiences, in supporting the activities, the invasion in Ukraine, and to basically creating an image of Ukraine as something that needs to be corrected. It also is and certainly has been in the past, an attempt to influence public opinion in other countries. The campaigns around AIDS, but also around some of the other developments, were clearly targeted against particular areas, AIDS and the HIV story about this being sort of constructed in US laboratories. That was meant to be listened to and recognized in African countries, and undermine the trust and confidence in African countries, in certain partners and countries in the West. In the Ukraine case, it certainly also was part of the justification for the invasion. It was obviously not the only one, but one of them. But it also is an attempt to demonize the other side. It hasn't necessarily changed the perception in the professional community of people who deal with the Biological Weapons Convention. But these accusations are out there, the processes are out there, the materials that have been used are widely available. And this is a very technical, complex issue. So it is right to be exploited for political purposes by whoever wants to try that. In this context, also just as a reminder, there is a special report that was done for the External Action Service of the Union, European Union, on coronavirus disinformation. And here it was stated quite bluntly that the Russian Federation was using disinformation to amplify division, sow distrust and chaos, and exacerbate crisis situations. So this is, in fact, one of the goals in this whole process, destabilizing societal aspects of our countries. How is this done? Rand Corporation came out with a report that called it a firehose of falsehood approach, or propaganda model. You can see that at the bottom of the page here. High volume and multi-channel, it comes from all sides, and it comes in vast numbers. It's rapid, it's continuous, it's repetitive, it rubs it in again and again and again. There's no commitment to objective reality. You will find facts that are actual facts, and you will find a lot of things that are not facts, and a lot of interpretations that are far from the truth. And also a lack of commitment to consistency. It doesn't have to make a consistent story. At the end of the day, something will stick. And so the more you throw it, the more you throw out, the more effective that could be. What's it all mean? I'm just putting out two. The first one is, I don't think it's a verbatim quote, but it's pretty close to it. The other one is verbatim from two people who are prominent in this field for a number of reasons. Matt Masterson from Harvard University, somebody who's been dealing with biological weapons and biological weapons arms control and issues related to it since, I don't know when, certainly since the 1960s. And he wrote at some point in time that the worst possible event, of course, is a true allegation of a BW used by a state. And obviously, since 1975, that would also imply a particular, if it's a state party to the treaty, that would be the worst possible thing that could happen. But the next worst thing is a false allegation of biological weapons use. And why is that? It's because it suggests that a state party is violating the BWC with impunity. And you will recall that this whole argument about impunity has already come up in the context of chemical weapons uses in Syria. Mechanisms that we have, certainly in the arms control domain, are not very good. They're not designed to deal with impunity issues. You need other mechanisms, other approaches, and they're not easy to find, and they're also not easy to work. So here is a risk that somebody can actually create a situation where this becomes acceptable, or becomes where it gets very difficult to respond to it. And that's the other side of the argument. It can also lead to perceptions that biological weapons actually have utility and that they may be desirable for states to go for. Philippa Lentzes from King's College in London is making more or less a similar argument, but several decades later, saying that by claiming biological weapons lab exists where they do not, Russia is hastening the death of the taboo. So this is not necessarily suggesting that that is the intention that Russia has, but it certainly is a possible and likely outcome that the more this happens, the more it is possible that other states will question the strength of the Biological Weapons Convention, will question its mechanisms, will question whether one can rely on it. And actually, it might encourage countries in their particular context to pursue the acquisition of biological weapons in the future. I don't want to summarize what I just said. I let that sink in. What I would want to give you at the end is simply a list of sources that you can find on the internet. The first one is a piece that we put out with a new network in Germany that deals with these Russian allegations. That's already been done a while ago. It's probably about 6-8 months old. But you see the basic argument in this piece. The next one is a foreign policy, a commentary on the issue. The next one is a link to the meeting documents of the formal consultative meeting under Article 5. So if you want to read any of the documents, you'll find them there. The next two articles by Milton Lichtenberg, who has looked a lot into the biological weapons program of Russia, and also in these disinformation campaigns. In particular, the last one, the detailed supplementary material, gives you a lot of access to specific allegations and the context within which they were made and what that means. And then finally, the bulletin article by Philippa and Jess Littlewood, which has just recently come out and sums up the current situation about this field. And that's it. And I'll stop there. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trapp, for the very insightful and comprehensive overview of quite a complex and not necessarily easy to swallow topic, and series of developments that we've been witnessing over the past several months. And of course, I mean, one of the most pernicious manifestations of that has been that we've seen high-level officials, people within military and within the high echelons of state power in Russia, essentially coming forward and pushing for those narratives, for those claims, and trying to present those as credible claims, whether despite the motives that's in any event, that's very difficult to find a credible explanation or justification, or even an excuse for that kind of approach to politics, be it domestic or foreign policy. I don't know if we have any. I'm just checking if